uh, Rachel Carson, kind of the godmother of the environmentalist movement, the idea that if your river is on fire, you've got environmental problems. And it's Rachel Carson's book that inspires the young people, especially, to demand of their government a fix to the environmental problems. And hence you have the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in the late 1960s. You've got Earth Day. You've got kind of an environmentalist movement that goes not just into the 60s, but into the 1970s. There are a number of events in the 1970s that people are concerned about with regard to the environment. A lot of exposure of toxic waste, nuclear waste, the 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown or near meltdown in Harrisburg in 1979 kind of turned people off to nuclear power. The discovery of a lot of toxic waste dumps around the country that we really hadn't been good stewards of the environment is going to lead to governmental action to clean those sites up. Feminism. Feminism gets its start in the 1960s with the young generation, the baby boomers who are going off to college. They're inspired in large part, by Betty Friedan's publication of The Feminine Mystique, which is kind of a declaration of independence for women. Betty Friedan outlines this idea that women need to be defined by what they accomplish on their own, independent of their husbands, independent of men. That women up until this point had really been defined by what their husbands did. And so she's really pushing for women to work on their own merits and achieve a level of independence. And she's one of the founders of the National Organization of Women, and that's really where the women's movement explodes, where women are fighting for equal access, equal pay. More and more women are on the job in the 1960s, yet they're paid less. That really hasn't been solved. They're fighting for access to birth control. For instance, Griswold versus Connecticut, the state of Connecticut banned access to birth control. And in 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional, that women should have access to those things. The birth control pill was invented in 1960, which led a lot of conservatives to fear that if women could take a birth control pill, they would be more lascivious in their attitudes towards sex. And I will say, I mean, there was something to that, because you do have the sexual revolution in the 1960s as well, where people felt that you could get away with consequence-free sex. Especially a lot of these women who are going off to college, you start to see that as well. There's a fight towards the late 1960s for an Equal Rights Amendment. Now, that was something that Alice Paul had proposed. If you remember Alice Paul from the World War I era, in the 1920s, she had proposed an Equal Rights Amendment to do for women what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment had done for African Americans. Put into the Constitution certain guarantees for women and equal access and equality. Now, that ERA that women proposed, that the National Organization of Women fought for, got passed by Congress in 1972. So Congress said it was great. Most of the national politicians supported an Equal Rights Amendment, but you had to send it to the states to be ratified. And under the Constitution, to get an amendment into the Constitution, you have to have 3/4 of the states ratify that amendment. So all during the 1970s, there is a battle over getting the Equal Rights Amendment ratified in the states. And a lot of conservatives rallied to block this Equal Rights Amendment from getting ratified in the states. One of the women who was most vociferous in getting this blocked was a woman named Phyllis Schlafly. She was a conservative going back to the 1960s. She had worked on Barry Goldwater's campaign in the 1964 election when Goldwater ran against Lyndon Johnson and lost big time. I mean, you know, Lyndon Johnson won 46 states in 1964. But she was one of the voices of the conservative movement who believed that if there was an Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution, it would destroy the foundation of the American family. That women would leave their husbands, leave their children, go off and do whatever. And so she rallied a lot of conservatives, and let's be honest, a lot of Christian conservatives to block the ERA. And indeed, if you got 3/4 of the states to ratify the ERA, you would have to get 38 states to ratify it. And you've got 10 years to do it. You've got 10 years to ratify an amendment. So 72 to 82, that was the time period. And you can see here the sign ERA 82. It hadn't been ratified by 1982. And in 1982, when the time was up to vote on the ERA, only 36 states had ratified it. Anybody want to take a stab at which region of the country as a block blocked the ERA? The South. That's what I like about the South. They're so progressive. Yes, she is pro-life, pro-family. She's a Fox News contributor.
She's still alive.
I know.
My grandma hates her.
I know.
She's like 86, and she used to I guess she was like one of those people.
You know in the past couple of weeks that there's been this emphasis on talking about equal pay for women, okay? Because still today, women earn 78 cents for every dollar a man earns. Phyllis Schlafly came out about 2 weeks ago, and I saw her on the news. She was on a bunch of different news programs, arguing against equal pay for women because she fears that if women earn the same as men, it will block their ability to find good husbands and providers. Guys, I'm telling you, that is an opinion out there, and it is not a small opinion either. There is a sizable chunk of the American population who dread the idea of women being independent and free. That women have a particular role to play. Kind of the heyday for women is the decision in 1973 by the Supreme Court to support a woman's right to get an abortion. Now that is a spark right there. This is a spark that begins a debate in the culture, what becomes known as the culture wars. Liberals support the idea of women having access to an abortion, women having equal pay to men, gays having rights, civil rights, etc. Conservatives, Republicans, are going to try to block this, believing that this also undermines the family structure. And it really begins a galvanization of a movement on the right. During the 1960s, you saw what was called the New Left. The New Left were the student movement, the young kids, the college students, the anti-war protests, the civil rights protests, the Native Americans, gay rights, environmentalists, all that. That's the New Left. The New Right that forms in the 1970s and early 80s is kind of the answer to all that push for equal rights and stuff in the 1960s and early 70s. And you start to see kind of both sides hardening their viewpoints. And these culture wars haven't abated. I mean, they're still being fought today. So yeah, in 1973, the case of Roe v. Wade guaranteed the right of women to free access to an abortion, and it really did galvanize the new right. And the new right politically achieves their goal of political dominance in 1980 with the Reagan Revolution. And that brings us to the Warren Court. There are 3 Chief Justices you need to know about. John Marshall, okay, pro-business, pro-federal government, states are subservient to the feds. McCulloch versus Maryland, Marbury versus Madison, what are the other big ones? Gibbon versus Ogden. Let's see. Cohen versus Virginia. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Worcester versus Georgia. The other Chief Justice, Roger Taney. The Charles River Bridge, the Warren River Bridge case. Monopolies hurt the common man. Dred Scott decision. That blacks are property. Okay. And then the other Chief Justice you need to know about is Earl Warren. He is Chief Justice from 1953 to 1969. Now, his big case, his debut as Chief Justice, was the 1954 decision, Brown v. Board of Ed. He got all 9 justices to agree that desegregation should occur nationally. Okay? So that's the beginning of the Warren Court. Brown v. Board of Ed, 1954. But the criticism of the Warren Court was that the Warren Court coddled criminals. For instance, Gideon versus Wainwright, that criminals need to have the right to access to an attorney. Miranda versus Arizona, 1966, that you don't have to incriminate yourself. And if the police don't tell you about your rights, you can get off. So a lot of people believe that the Warren Court coddled criminals and that the Warren Court was too activist, what a lot of conservatives call legislating from the bench. The president didn't do it, the Congress didn't do it, but the Supreme Court makes decisions that affect law nationwide. Brown, ending segregation throughout the country. Griswold, Griswold versus Connecticut, that the ban on contraceptives, the pill, for instance, was illegal. Abingdon, that states didn't have a right to force people to say prayers in public school. There was a great deal of criticism, especially among conservatives, that the Warren Court, that the court of Earl Warren, was way too activist in its decisions. That the people didn't have a say in these decisions, Congress didn't have a say, but that the court was just kind of legislating from the bench. All right. Politics in the 19th century. We'll go through Kennedy. Kennedy. Johnson. Maybe we get to Nixon. Okay. Kennedy, short presidency, 2.5 years, little over 1,000 days. There's not much of a record. Okay. A lot of people put Kennedy in the upper echelon of presidents because of the legend that's created after his assassination. But in terms of actual legislative accomplishments that Kennedy could point to, there was not much. Okay? With regard to Kennedy, he called his program the New Frontier. He appealed to the nation's youth. He said we need to create better relations around the world. We need to confront the Soviets and get rid of what he called the missile gap, with the launch of Sputnik and the creation of ICBMs and rocket-launched nuclear missiles. Kennedy argued that the Eisenhower administration had kind of fallen asleep at the switch, because Eisenhower was old and Kennedy was young, and Kennedy was going to be youthful and vigorous, and confront those gaps that were perceived. The space race challenges America to go to the moon. He advocates for health care for the poor, wants to tackle poverty. He also wants to reduce income taxes. So in that regard, he almost sounds like a conservative Republican. He was a believer in trickle-down economics. The couple of things to know about the Kennedy presidency. The Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps. Confronting the Russians, not with bullets, not with missiles, but with goodness. Okay? The Alliance for Progress. Financial aid and partnerships with Latin American countries. Okay? You build them up economically. It's almost like dollar diplomacy. You build them up economically. You send Americans into Latin American countries to help build up their infrastructure, to build up their society, and you provide a nice face for the American ideal. The Peace Corps. Anybody here have parents who were in the Peace Corps? Grandparents in the Peace Corps? Nobody? Sending young Americans around the world to help improve the life of folks in various countries, in various places that were, behind the times. And Kennedy believed that this would sell America as a country that was helping people, and that would be a better picture for folks around the world. If they're just deciding between, well, do we back America or do we back the Russians? Well, let's back America. They help us out. Remember back to Kennan's telegram, the X-telegram, where he says, we must provide a better example for the world than the Russians do. Well, that's Kennedy taking that idea, providing a good example. The Bay of Pigs. This was something that Kennedy inherited from Eisenhower. Eisenhower, he was famous for using the CIA to go in and destabilize communist or suspected communist governments. And there was a plan in the works to train Cuban exiles who were living in Florida, using the CIA to arm them and train them, and then have those Cuban exiles invade Cuba, begin a revolution against the Castro regime, and then America would come in and recognize this new government. Kennedy had his misgivings about this plan. It seemed too ham-handed, and Kennedy really wasn't sure whether it was a good idea to do this. But the advisors all told Kennedy, the CIA, the military, all told Kennedy that it would work, that it was foolproof, that it would be successful, that Kennedy had talked to Eisenhower. Eisenhower told him that it was a good idea. Nixon even told Kennedy it was a good idea. The Vice President Nixon, under Eisenhower, had done a lot of the legwork to plan this. And so Kennedy reluctantly went ahead with it. And when these Cuban exiles who had been trained down in Miami landed on the beach in Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs, Castro already knew they were coming. Castro's forces were there to meet them. They were stuck. They were surrounded. They called America for backup, and Kennedy cut them off. Kennedy left them hanging. So a lot of Cubans are very upset with Kennedy, and they really haven't forgiven the Democrats. Latinos, by and large, vote Democratic. In the last election, Latinos voted 70% to 30% Democrat over Republican. But the one Latino group that votes Republican all the time are the Cubans. Still. And that's from this. I've got friends of ours. My wife grew up in Miami. And we've got friends of ours who are Cuban. And just whenever we go out to eat, I'll just needle them and I'll bring up Kennedy or I'll bring up the Democrats and they go off. They still do. I mean, these are kids of Cuban refugees. I mean, they're natural born American citizens and they hate the Democrats. In 1961, right after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And by the way, this is like 2 months into Kennedy's administration, the Bay of Pigs. And Kennedy looks like a neophyte. He looks like a person who's not up to the job. And the Russian leader, Nikita Khrushchev, meets with Kennedy over in Geneva at a summit meeting and tries to roll Kennedy. Talks down to him. It doesn't respect Kennedy. The Soviet leader attempted to bully Kennedy into making concessions on Berlin. Khrushchev still wanted to try to get the Americans out of West Berlin. Just because the Berlin airlift had been successful back during the Truman administration doesn't mean the Soviets weren't still trying to get the Americans out of West Berlin. Kennedy called the meeting with Khrushchev the roughest thing in my life. He just beat the hell out of me. So Kennedy's first couple of months in office are taken up by the Bay of Pigs fiasco and this really bad meeting with Khrushchev, where Khrushchev is trying to get one over on Kennedy. And Khrushchev believes that he can push Kennedy around. So the Russians, again, are going to try to push the Americans out of West Berlin. They build up their army, they build up their forces here in East Berlin with the threat that they are going to drive the Americans out. And when the Americans refuse to leave, that's when the Russians build the Berlin Wall. And it's at the Berlin Wall that Kennedy gives his famous Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a jelly donut speech. That you realize Berlin? Okay, you got that. All right, fantastic. Mr. Everly taught you. The translation got mixed up. But the Berlin Wall that's built during the Kennedy administration becomes the symbol now of that Iron Curtain, that divide between the Western world and the American allies and the Eastern Bloc countries and the Russians. In the 1980s, Reagan goes to the Berlin Wall, for a Kennedy-esque backdrop. And I mean, he's got a similar line that comes out of that. Anybody know the line from that speech in 1987? Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Now, Khrushchev, believing he can push Kennedy around, and because the Kennedy administration had backed that invasion of Cuba, Castro asks Khrushchev for help. Khrushchev is more than happy to help out the communist government in Cuba to defend itself from American imperialists. And the Soviets start to install nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. Now, Kennedy cannot have nuclear missiles capable of attacking Washington, D.C. in 10 minutes. Cannot have it. Now, Kennedy is being told by the CIA and by the military, invade Cuba. Just invade Cuba, go in, take out the missiles, take over the freaking government, and install a pro-American government in Cuba. But what Kennedy realizes is there are Russians in Cuba. And if you invade Cuba and kill Russians, you now start World War III. So Kennedy confronts the question that Eisenhower had to confront, that Truman had to confront. Truman, are you willing to start World War III over Korea? Truman says no. Eisenhower, are you willing to start World War III over Hungary? Eisenhower says no. Kennedy, are you willing to start World War III over Cuba? That's the question. So if we invade, that's it. World War III starts. If we do nothing, then Kennedy reinforces the idea that he is weak on confronting the Russians. So he comes up with option 3, and that is a quarantine, a blockade of Cuba. American ships are going to position themselves to prevent further Russian ships from delivering parts and supplies to the island of Cuba. Now, this whole confrontation lasts 13 days in October 1962. And this is as close as America and the Russians ever came to actually going to war. Because what's going to happen if those Russian ships cross that quarantine? What is Kennedy prepared to do? Is Kennedy prepared to fire on these Russian ships? Is he going to sink Russian ships? Because then that's the ball game. Luckily, cooler minds prevail. On the 13th day, the Russian ships that are headed for the line turn back. This international game of chicken is over. The Russians blink. But it wasn't just that Khrushchev blinked. It's that there was a deal made. And this was the deal. The Russians would pull these missiles out of Cuba. In exchange, America would pull its nuclear missiles out of Turkey. We had nuclear missiles in Turkey with the same capability of attacking Russia in about 5 to 10 minutes that these missiles would have given Russia to attack us. So it was kind of missiles for missiles. And Kennedy makes a promise that the U.S. will never invade Cuba. That's the deal. We allow the Castro government to go on. And the Russians promise not to put missiles in Cuba. And since 1963, we have had a trade embargo on Cuba and a travel embargo. You can't buy anything from Cuba. You can't travel to Cuba, even today. Kennedy and Khrushchev recognized that America and Russia came close to nuclear war in 1962. That's why the Americans and the Russians signed the first nuclear arms treaty in 1963. It is called the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and it forbids the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. You can have nuclear tests underground, but there will be no more nuclear tests above ground. And this is Kennedy delivering his speech about the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty at American University in 1963. Now, a lot of people always ask, what about Kennedy in Vietnam? Didn't Kennedy send troops to Vietnam? There were already troops in Vietnam when Kennedy became president in 1961. Eisenhower had put them there. Now, they were military advisors, they were Green Berets, it was a lot of CIA, it was a lot of hush-hush, secret stuff. In 1961, 62, 63, Kennedy continued that Eisenhower policy of trying to prop up and support the government of No Diem in South Vietnam. That was our client state. That was our way of containing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. But by 1963, it was becoming apparent to Kennedy that the government of No Diem did not hold wide support in South Vietnam. And so Kennedy decided to change American policy in Vietnam. Kennedy ordered the assassination of the South Vietnamese leader No Diem. And Diem was killed by the CIA November 1st, 1963. Because you had all of these, this is a Buddhist monk burning himself in the middle of a street to protest the government of No Diem. This is what Kennedy was having to confront. I mean, we cannot keep backing this guy up. He is incompetent. And so Kennedy orders him. Now, Kennedy says to his advisors, we need to make a more clear decision on what we're going to do in Vietnam. Now, I've got a trip to Dallas that I'm taking in the third week of November this year. I know we just got rid of No Diem. I'm flying to Dallas, but when I come back from Dallas, we'll make a clearer decision on what to do in Vietnam. My inclination is for America to withdraw its support. And you know that he never comes back from Dallas. His most valuable advisor was his brother, Bobby Kennedy. He was the Attorney General. He was an advisor to JFK. He helped ink the Cuba deal. And probably Bobby Kennedy's great legacy was when Kennedy came around on civil rights, ordering troops into Mississippi, ordering troops into Alabama to desegregate those universities, to quell a lot of the domestic uprisings that were going on there, a lot of the riots that were going on. Bobby Kennedy used the full authority of the Justice Department to go down and tamp down those domestic problems. With regard to civil rights, you had, George Wallace proclaiming segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. You had Martin Luther King in jail, writing from his jail cell. You've got, the bombings of, churches throughout the South, the bombing of the Birmingham church, the Baptist church where 4 students were killed. You had voter registration workers killed in Mississippi in 1964. So Kennedy reluctantly, in 1963, also proposes civil rights legislation. So in 1963, JFK is pushing now for civil rights, and he's talking about getting us out of Vietnam. And the question is, what could have been if Kennedy had lived? But we all know Kennedy goes to Texas. Him and Lyndon Johnson go down to Texas. Kennedy in November 1963 is gearing up for the 1964 re-election. He goes to Texas because he needs Texas to win re-election. He brings his vice president, a native Texan, with him. And they're on a 5-city tour of Texas. And on the morning of November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy and his entourage fly from Fort Worth to Love Field in Dallas. They hop in a motorcade. They're traveling through downtown Dallas on their way to a speech at the Trade Mart in Dallas, where Kennedy's going to talk about confronting a lot of this insanity, a lot of this craziness, a lot of the radicals. If you ever get a chance, read the speech that Kennedy was supposed to deliver that afternoon. That speech could be given today, and it would have meaning about we can't listen to the nut jobs. The nut jobs are driving the debate, and we've got to stop. But we all know that Kennedy is killed in Dealey Plaza. And according to the investigation that occurs after the Kennedy assassination, the Warren Commission, headed up by Chief Justice Earl Warren, they reveal that the assassin was Lee Harvey Oswald, a loner, a wannabe, a former Marine who had gone to Russia, had been in exile, came back, had led a group called Fair Play for Cuba. He was a wannabe radical, but he was a loner. He was a loser. And Oswald had acted alone, according to the Warren Commission report. And so, as a result of the Kennedy assassination, you now have the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson in November 63 announces that he's going to finish what JFK had started, and that Johnson believed. Johnson's a New Dealer. Johnson got his start in the 1930s during the heyday of the New Deal. He had risen to political power in the 1950s as the Senate Majority Leader. So Lyndon Johnson was no stranger to pulling the levers of power. He knew everybody in Congress. He was a much more able legislator than John F. Kennedy ever was. So basically, everything that Kennedy had proposed, Johnson was able to get passed. And in the election of 1964, the American people overwhelmingly vote for Lyndon Johnson. Although, notice the beginning of a switch. The conservative movement, the conservatives in the South, those folks who don't like civil rights, they don't like any of that stuff that Kennedy or Johnson is proposing, they start voting Republican in 1964, and they vote for Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. He is as conservative as you get. He had voted against the Civil Rights Bill of 64. He had voted against, a lot of the other initiatives that Kennedy and Johnson had put forward. He believed that America was within its right to use nuclear weapons if it must. His famous phrase was, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice." Think about that one. He did not believe in moderation. He did not believe in compromise. His belief was it was our way or the highway. Now, that idea was not popular in 1964, but brother, that idea becomes popular by 1980. Barry Goldwater really is the godfather of the Reagan Revolution that takes place in 1980. As a matter of fact, Ronald Reagan politically switches parties from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party in 1964 to campaign for Barry Goldwater. And a lot of people, when they heard Ronald Reagan give his speech in 1964, said, "We nominated the wrong guy." Now, in 1966, Ronald Reagan uses that exposure from the 64 election to get elected governor twice of California. So Ronald Reagan is the governor of California during a lot of these student protests, students taking over the government or taking over the college administration buildings, a lot of the riots, a lot of the civil rights stuff going on in the 1960s. Ronald Reagan was there using the authority of the governor of California to tamp a lot of that down. So he becomes kind of a symbol for law and order, conservative ideals, family values, military strength. Ronald Reagan kind of encapsulates everything that's great about the conservative movement. Now, Lyndon Johnson proposes what he calls the Great Society. In a great society, no one should go homeless, no one should go hungry, no one should go uneducated. In this war on poverty, Johnson is going to propose civil rights legislation and voting rights and get it passed. Pre-K, Head Start, and low-interest college loans for college students. Housing and urban development. Low-cost housing for people in poverty. A transportation bill to build roads and railroads and public transit. How do you think Washington, D.C. got the money to build the metro? The transportation bill in 1964. Medicare for old people, Medicaid for poor people, and welfare, food stamps, government programs put in place to help people who are poor, unemployed, not as a hammock, but as a springboard to get people back into the workplace. And I said, it's funny how 3 decades later, sweeping welfare reform becomes Bill Clinton's biggest achievement. Lyndon Johnson had put welfare in place, and by the 1990s, the Democrats campaigned against welfare. Shows you how much the Democratic Party changed from the 1960s to the 1990s. This is the Great Society program, and I know it's really, small, but I just wanted to show you the number of bills. The 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. You could not charge people to vote. Southern states used to do that. They used to charge people a poll tax, knowing that blacks, by and large, could not afford the poll tax. Now, after the Supreme Court shot down the Voting Rights Act of 1964 or 65, a lot of Southern states enacted voter ID laws that you had to have an ID, a government-issued ID, in order to vote. Well, doesn't that require you to go out and get a driver's license? Even if you don't own a car, you're required to have a driver's license in order to vote. Doesn't that government requiring you to pay for something you may or may not want constitute a poll tax? That hasn't been brought up to the Supreme Court yet. Voting Rights Act outlawed literacy tests. Southern states used to demand that people pass a literacy test in order to get the right to vote. That's outlawed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Economic opportunity, Job Corps, Vista, Volunteers in Service to America, kind of the Peace Corps just here in America. Medical Care Act creates Medicare. The Minimum Wage Act raises the minimum wage. Heck, we can't even get the minimum wage raised in this country. Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, Higher Education Act. There's also public television. NPR was created by the Johnson administration. urban mass transportation, Housing Act, creating HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Act, Metropolitan Area Redevelopment Cities Act, Wilderness Preservation. He's an environmental president. Air and Water Quality Acts, Tax Reduction Act. So not only are we creating these government programs, we're also reducing taxes in the process, and an Immigration Act. This Immigration Act of 1965 overturns the National Origins Act of 1924. As a result, you have an influx of new immigrants to America, mainly from Latin American countries, Middle Eastern countries, and Southeast Asian countries. Now that war on, if all Johnson did was that war on poverty, he'd have a legacy like FDR's. But unfortunately, Johnson gets caught up in Vietnam. Kennedy had talked about pulling us out of Vietnam. Johnson, running for re-election in 1964, doesn't want to appear weak on communism, and so he doubles down on Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. Supposedly, 2 American ships were attacked by North Vietnamese communists in early 1964. Johnson calls the attack unprovoked and asks Congress for authority to wage war against these North Vietnamese troops. Congress gives Johnson basically a blank check. It is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And it basically tells LBJ, you go fight your little war in Vietnam. Here's everything you need. And between 1964 and 1968, Johnson is going to escalate America's involvement in Vietnam from a little under 5,000 troops in 1964 to 750,000 American troops by 1968. We dropped more bomb tonnage on North Vietnam than we dropped on Europe and Japan combined during World War II. We killed 7 million Vietnamese citizens. And yet, they were still winning. It didn't matter how much we escalated our involvement, there was no way to win in Vietnam. Johnson now is confronted with spending on the war in Vietnam and spending on his domestic program. It's what's called the guns and butter debate. Can you have foreign policy spending and domestic spending at the same time? Because all of this stuff costs money. And he says we can continue the Great Society while we fight in Vietnam. But by 1967-68, Johnson and Congress realize it's too much. And so most of the Great Society programs had their funding slashed by the 1970s. As a result of all that money going into circulation, you start to have widespread rampant inflation in the 1970s. By 1968, oh yeah, that guy doesn't make it. By 1968, it becomes apparent that we are not winning in Vietnam, even though for 4 years Lyndon Johnson had been telling the American people we were winning. Victory was just around the corner. I need 25,000 more troops. I need 50,000 more troops. In January 1968, the North Vietnamese launch a massive, multi-pronged attack on 50 or more targets in South Vietnam, including the American embassy in Saigon. And the American people say, wait a minute, if we're winning in Vietnam, how in the world was this possible? The Tet Offensive, the Tet being a Vietnamese, it's like Vietnamese New Year. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 is the single most important event in convincing Americans that the war in Vietnam was unwinnable. Public support for the Vietnam War, which had been the majority opinion up until 1968. Most Americans supported the war in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive flips those numbers. Most Americans after January 68 do not support the war in Vietnam or Lyndon Johnson. I love that picture of Lyndon Johnson. I love it. It says so much about how his presidency was destroyed by Vietnam. And when it's revealed what Americans are doing in Vietnam, the My Lai massacre, I mean, we went into towns and villages. Our goal was to win the hearts and minds of these villagers to keep them from supporting the Vietnamese communists, or the Viet Cong, as they're called, Vietnamese communists. But we're killing civilians left and right. The My Lai massacre is probably the most notorious of the massacres that occurred, led by a lieutenant named William Calley, who, by the way, is still in jail today for this. This was uncovered by Seymour Hersh in 1969 after the Johnson administration was over, but it just shows what the war in Vietnam had devolved into. What in the world are we doing over there? Are we containing communism, or are we just killing people randomly? The Vietnam War, more than anything else, and Vietnam War and civil rights, divides the Democrats. The Democratic Party, the New Deal coalition that had been created by Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, is divided over Vietnam, over civil rights. The Doves, the peace candidates for the Democrats, go ahead, do whatever you need to do. The Democrats, the Doves, the peace candidates in 1968 support Robert Kennedy for the Democratic nomination. Lyndon Johnson announces in March 1968 that he is not seeking re-election, even though under the 25th Amendment, or under the 22nd Amendment, he could have. The Hawks, the pro-war side of the Democratic Party, they support Johnson's Vice President, Hubert H. Humphrey. By the way, Hubert doesn't get elected president. Hubert. He gets a Metrodome named after him in Minneapolis, where he's from. And look, this just kind of spurs the idea that 1968 in and of itself is a crazy year. In January, you've got the Tet Offensive. Walter Cronkite, the anchor for CBS Evening News, in talking about the Tet Offensive, basically he's the most trusted man in America in 1968, basically tells the American people the war in Vietnam is unwinnable and we should get out now. So, in January 68, public opinion turns against the Vietnam War. So much so that in March 1968, LBJ announces that he is withdrawing from the presidential race in 1968. It leaves the Democratic nomination open. And that's why you've got the divide between those that want to get out of Vietnam with RFK and those who want to double down in Vietnam with Hubert Humphrey. A week after LBJ announces that he's withdrawing, Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Riots break out across the country, race riots. I think it was actually less than a week. because LBJ announced on March 30th, and then King was killed April 4th. So that week was crazy. Then Robert Kennedy comes out. He's in Indianapolis campaigning for the Democratic nomination. Robert Kennedy comes out and basically, encourages people to be calm down. He tells the black population in Indianapolis, to calm down. He says, I had a brother and he was killed too. He was killed by a white man. I understand your frustration, but we need to move forward in a peaceful manner. And a lot of people believe that Robert Francis Kennedy, the brother of the slain president, was going to get the Democratic nomination in 1968. As a matter of fact, in June 1968, he wins the California primary, and he is on his way to winning the Democratic nomination when he too is assassinated in Los Angeles. And so Johnson withdrawing, funding for the Great Society is being pulled. Martin Luther King killed, Robert Kennedy killed. People are frustrated by the war. They're frustrated by a lack of action. They're frustrated by all of the things that are that are happening in 1968, and a lot of cities around the country erupt into violence. You have another one of these long, hot summers in 1968. By the way, that's Washington, D.C. That's U Street in D.C. In the summer of 68, the Democrats meet. RFK, the Dove candidate, is gone. Hubert Humphrey, the war candidate, is the nominee, and the Peace Democrats protest against their own nominee. And in Grant Park, outside the Democratic convention, riots break out. And the Chicago police are called in to pepper spray and billy club the protesters. And it is all happening on live TV. The students, with blood streaming in their faces from being beaten by billy clubs, are yelling in they're grabbing the television cameras and they're yelling in the cameras, "The whole world is watching! The whole world is watching!" America in 1968 is at a place it hadn't been at since the Civil War. George Wallace, the current Alabama governor, I love that cartoon. He's calling for states' rights and law and order, but really underneath it, he's just a racist. Wallace runs as a third-party candidate on a law and order platform. He tries to smooth over that whole segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever talk. By the way, does anybody know who wrote that line? Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever? The guy who wrote that line was a speechwriter for George Wallace in 1962-63. Goes on later on to author The Outlaw Josie Wales. If you've ever seen that movie, which is a really great movie. In 1968, Richard Nixon, who had been left for political dead after he had lost the presidency in 1960 and then lost the race for governor in 1962 in California, Richard Nixon, he's tanned, he's rested, he's ready. He's back, baby! And in 1968, appealing to what he calls the silent majority of law-abiding citizens who demand law and order from their government, Richard Nixon appeals to middle-class, white, conservative voters. He calls for a new federalism. He says the government can't do everything for you. Some of that authority has got to go back to the states. And Nixon wins. But notice, notice, there's George Wallace. George Wallace appealed to a good majority, or not a majority, but a good sizable part of the population. I think he got like 10-15% of the vote. George Wallace. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. 10-15% of the vote. Boy, you know, if Richard Nixon could somehow convince these guys to vote Republican, man, he'd have himself a majority, a real clear majority. Richard Nixon is elected promising law and order and that he has a secret plan to win the war in Vietnam. So Nixon, what's your plan? He calls it Vietnamization. We are going to gradually pull out of Vietnam, turning responsibility for fighting the war back to the native population. Kind of like the Afghanistanification. Yeah, exactly. It's you could call it Afghanistanification or Iraqification. It's the same thing. We declare victory and we gradually pull out. And we won! USA! USA! So, yeah. So not only are we going to pull out, but we're going to bomb the crap out of other countries as we do so. In 1970, we bombed the neutral country of Cambodia, pulling out of Vietnam because Cambodia was where a lot of the supply lines from North Vietnam into South Vietnam were. It was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So Nixon orders the Christmas bombing of Cambodia. Merry Christmas, suckers! A lot of Nixon's foreign policy is coordinated by his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. That's right. Henry Kissinger is going to be the guy who is going to help Nixon to put together a plan, a wide-ranging vision. Henry Kissinger is still alive today. And his idea is called triangulation. This means that America is going to play the Russians off the Chinese off the Vietnamese, and get deals from all three. I'll show you how it works. Nixon goes to China in 1972. We never recognized the government of Mao Zedong back in 1949. And from 1949 to 1972, we basically ignored 1 billion Chinese people. Said they didn't exist. In 1972, Nixon goes to China and opens relations with Communist China. Why? To scare the bejesus out of the Russians. Because now America is cozying up to the Chinese communists. It convinces the Russians to get a deal, and it convinces the North Vietnamese to sue for peace, because the Chinese who had been supplying the North Vietnamese are no longer going to do it. And so, from the visit to China in 72, you get the North Vietnamese signing the Paris Peace Accords of 1973, so the war in Vietnam comes to an end. Nixon can end the draft, withdraw the last troops from Vietnam. Now, eventually, when we pull out of Vietnam, South Vietnam falls in 1975, which basically, when we pull out of Afghanistan, is going to go back to Al-Qaeda. I'm just telling you right now. Mark my words. Place your bets. And then with the Russians, Nixon gets a ton of arms deals with the Russians. We declare what's called détente, peaceful coexistence with the Russians. The Russians are allowed to do things in their sphere, we do our things in our sphere, and Nixon declares what's called the Nixon Doctrine. We cannot contain communism everywhere. We cannot be the world's policeman, he announces. Sometimes you're just on your own. Nixon, Ford, and Carter are going to be proponents of this détente, or peaceful coexistence, with the Russians. And with the Russians, we get a ton of agreements, including the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the first treaty to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, in 1972. In 1979, Carter signed SALT II, but it was not ratified by the Senate because in the same breath the Russians had invaded Afghanistan, and we decided that détente was over. We were going to boycott the Moscow Olympics in 1980. Guys, ending the war in Vietnam, Nixon opening China, expanding Social Security, expanding the EPA, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. Nixon wins in a landslide in 1972. It's not even close. Now, Nixon does what's called the Southern Strategy. Now, when you hear folks out there talk about how certain elements are not racist and they're not playing the race card, they are full of crap. Because here it is, in the words of Kevin Phillips, senior political advisor to Nixon in 1970. This is what the Republicans said. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the Negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. It is called the Southern Strategy. You scare the bejesus out of white conservative Southerners, and they will vote Republican. That's where the votes are. And that's true. In 1970, that's where the votes were. Not now. Demographic makeup of the country is changing, man. Now, Nixon's second term, a couple of bad things. The release of what are known as the Pentagon Papers. It is revealed that Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon knew all along that the war in Vietnam was unwinnable. This was a statistical analysis of the war in Vietnam that was published. It was a secret study. And the guy who released it was a guy named Daniel Ellsberg. He's the guy who had conducted the study, and he released it to the New York Times. And Nixon said, how in the world is this information getting out to the press? We need to find a way to plug these leaks and stop these leaks from occurring. I need to have the capacity to have a private organization within the White House to go after people like Ellsberg and others who are leaking information to the American people that we don't want leaked. That's why Nixon forms a group called the Plumbers, because plumbers fix leaks. And the plumbers, like Gordon Liddy here, who hosts a radio show every afternoon from 1 to 3 in Washington, D.C., and is a contributor to Fox News, Gordon Liddy and a bunch of ex-CIA agents operating out of the White House are going to do black bag operations and dirty tricks for Richard Nixon. They're going to try to sabotage Nixon's political enemies. They're going to go after people like Ellsberg. They break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in order to rifle through his private medical files to get dirt on Ellsberg to discredit him. They bombed the Brookings Institute, which is a liberal think tank in Washington, D.C. And most notoriously, the plumbers break into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, where they try to plant bugs on the phones and rifle through the information about the Democratic nominees for 1972. They are caught. And the Nixon administration uses campaign funds to buy their silence. That is impeding an investigation. Woodward and Bernstein, the writers for the Washington Post, uncover this scandal within the White House. And at first it appears it's only people outside the White House. A group called the Committee to Re-elect the President. I cannot make this stuff up. The group was called CREEP. They were the ones using campaign contributions to pay off the Watergate burglars to keep their mouths shut. And when Woodward and Bernstein start following where these payments are coming from, they discover that that the payments are coming from inside the White House. A special prosecutor is hired to investigate the Watergate break-in. But when Archibald Cox reveals that the payments are coming from within the White House, Nixon orders Cox fired. He says to his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, you need to fire Cox. Richardson says, no, I can't do it, and resigns in protest. The next guy, the Assistant Attorney General, William Ruggles-House, is ordered to fire Cox. Ruggles-House says no and resigns in protest. They get down to like the janitor at the Justice Department. No, it's actually the number 3 guy at Justice, a guy named Robert Bork. I cannot make up these names. Bork fires Cox, but it's too late, because they reveal that there's a taping system in the White House and all of Nixon's conversations are recorded. Just wait. And when the tapes are ordered released to the Congressional Committee overseeing the Watergate investigation, Nixon says no. The Supreme Court says you must turn over the tapes. And when they turn over the tapes, it is revealed that Nixon had ordered all of this to occur. He has no political support and resigns in August 74 and is then pardoned by President Ford. Sayonara, folks.
Yeah, these are the key terms I owe you. Sorry it took so long.
It's okay, my friend. Yeah, it's all right. I understand. Now I'm going to continue to go through, now that class is over, I'm going to continue to go through and finish up some of this material. The 1970s. The 1970s, you're seeing a lot of cultural, political, social developments and changes. I know this is a long list of things, but if we can get the screen up here to see it, there we go. There we are. You've got higher divorce rates, increased premarital sex, fewer women having children early, increased couples living together outside of marriage, increased recognition of homosexual lifestyle, rise in female-headed households, hence you've got latchkey kids, rise in drug use, rise in crime rates. You have a 10 to 15% annual inflation rate that's spurred by an energy crisis and oil embargoes. You've got a growing concern about the environment. You've got concern about carcinogens in the food and water. Declining standard of living for lower and middle class Americans. You've got a push for health, jogging, self-improvement, and spirituality. You're seeing more equality for women and blacks, an increasing use of sex in public forums, a decline in mainstream Christian Protestantism and Catholicism, and a rise in evangelical churches. You're seeing the graying of America, people living longer, putting strains on the Social Security system, and the deindustrialization of America, where America's moving from an industrial economy to a service economy and lower paying jobs. A lot of the industrial jobs are going to be shipped overseas. Kayla, I saw you. I know, I'm still recording here. In the 1970s, you're seeing a great deal of economic woes, high inflation, for instance, caused by a lot of the spending on the Vietnam War and the Great Society programs. Also, the oil embargoes that occur in the 1970s are going to make the amount of money worth less and less and less. So people are working harder, they're working longer, they're getting paid less, and the money isn't worth anything. Deindustrialization is going to lead to high employment. This is U.S. manufacturing between 1947 and 2007. You can see over this time span that the amount of industrial manufacturing that goes on in the United States declines precipitously over that time span. In the 1970s, you're seeing high energy prices caused by oil embargoes. This is due in large part to America's support for Israel in a series of Arab-Israeli wars, most notably the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Arab countries that produced a lot of oil organized together into a group called OPEC, Oil and Petroleum Exporting Countries, to cut off America's oil supply. And in 1979, during the Iranian hostage crisis, Iran is going to cut off its oil supply to the United States. It's going to lead to gas lines. It's going to lead to shortages of gasoline. The price of gasoline is going to skyrocket. In today's money, it would be the equivalent of gas being about $4.25 a gallon. Inflation from Vietnam and Great Society spending is going to skyrocket in the 1970s. Gerald Ford tries to put together a program called Whip Inflation Now. It's largely unsuccessful. And when you have this high inflation coupled with deindustrialization and high unemployment, you have a stagnant economy. It's called stagflation. High inflation, high unemployment. The economy of the 1970s is the worst it had been since the Great Depression. In 1976, in the wake of the Ford pardon of Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter wins when Ford runs for re-election. Jimmy Carter campaigns as an outsider, not of Washington, D.C., someone who was honest, someone who was, a Southern Democrat. He was a born-again Christian, which was something new in American politics. Carter wins in 1976 in a very narrow, surprisingly narrow, presidential campaign. And you can see here Southern Democrats coming back into the fold, believing Jimmy Carter to be one of their own. Jimmy Carter uses human rights as a cornerstone of his foreign policy in promoting what's called the Camp David Peace Accords. This is the first Arab-Israeli peace deal between Egypt and Israel and the United States. It's probably the high watermark of the Carter presidency, and there aren't many high watermarks in the Carter presidency. You've got the nuclear disaster at 3 Mile Island, which leads to feelings that America can't get anything right. There's a near meltdown. It leads to fear and concern over nuclear power. Since 1979, when this occurred, not a single nuclear power plant has been built in the United States. A lot of people believe that the Carter administration were just days of malaise, misery, and funk. And nothing summed that up better than the Iranian hostage crisis. 444 days. There was a revolution in Iran to overthrow the Shah that we had imposed on Iran back in 1953. The Iranians remembered that. They blamed the Americans. They blamed the CIA. And when the Shah came to America seeking treatment for cancer and was in exile, and the Iranians demanded him back, when America refused to give the Shah back, that's when they took the embassy hostage.